We've now discussed some of the most important political and cultural responses to the memory or legacy of the French Revolution. But that political revolution, as important as it was only one part of the historical context that influenced intellectual life in the early 19th century. And so in this lecture, we're going to turn to another critically important part of the context in which intellectuals were developing new ideas and new writings. Historians often describe the era of the late 18th and early 19th centuries as the period of two revolutions, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. We've discussed some of the ways in which the French Revolution spread the ideas of the Enlightenment and stimulated the development of a whole range of new political theories, from conservatism to liberalism to nationalism to various forms of romanticism and so forth. But the revolutionary political changes also became part of a wider challenge to tradition. There's this whole romantic and cultural challenge to the 18th century. But the Romantics and most other writers of the era could also see the effects of an evolving economic and industrial revolution. Although the term Industrial Revolution came much later. It wasn't at the time called an Industrial Revolution, something that historians developed as a term to describe what was happening in the late 18th and 19th centuries. This Industrial Revolution also stimulated new social theories, and that's why we can compare it to the French political revolution, cultural revolution. Now, the great economic transformation eventually affected everyone in modern societies. Even people who had no interest in politics could not ignore the effects of the Industrial Revolution. And so the Industrial Revolution became a social context that elicited as much analysis as the political revolutions. And we're now going to turn to both the context and the texts of the new industrial age. The Industrial Revolution developed first in England, expanding very rapidly during the era of the French Revolution and Napoleon. In fact, the main takeoff period of the Industrial Revolution occurred between 1780 and 1830. But by the mid-19th century, a new industrial economy was developing on the continent as well as in Britain, and by later in the 19th century, the industrial system was very widespread in Germany and France, in the Low Countries, and in other parts of the continent. The theoretical response to this industrial revolution emerged in the rise of modern economics and modern social science, all of which dealt in various ways with the impact of the Industrial Revolution. And one of the interesting things about this economic revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the political revolution of the period between 1780 and 1830 is that these revolutions also coincided with the German philosophical revolution that we've talked about, that revolution from Kant to Hegel. And these changes, these revolutions, coincided with early Romanticism. And so in various ways we might say the whole emergence of modernity takes place in a number of ways in this 50-year period between about 1780, 1830, or 1840. Political revolution of the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the Philosophical Revolution, the revolution in culture and Romanticism, and all of these things come together in various ways to create what we now call the modern world. Well, the Industrial Revolution changed the social and economic relations between people, very much like the French Revolution also altered such relations. Both of these revolutions challenged the old order and the old nobility, but they seemed to produce different patterns. The theory and practice of the French Revolution pushed toward the creation of political equality. The notion of political equality was the dominant theme that came out of the French Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, however, produced new forms of economic inequality, and this posed a problem for theorists. How could the ideas of political equality and legal equality the ideas of the French Revolution, how could these be reconciled with the new economic inequalities, the consequence of the Industrial Revolution? So in certain ways, these two revolutions seem to be working in different directions. And it was precisely the search for an answer to that question, how can we reconcile political equality with economic inequality, that shaped many of the theoretical debates in 19th century Europe and also led to the rise of socialism. Socialism is, in a very specific way, an attempt to bring together these two problems and find a way to achieve more economic equality to go with political equality. Well, in order to analyze the cultural significance of this economic transformation, I want to note several important features of the Industrial Revolution. We have to look at this new social and economic context and what it meant. But after looking briefly at the Industrial Revolution, I want to turn to the intellectual problem of how this new economy generated a new theoretical defense of the capitalist economy. Because a whole set of theorists emerged who tried to explain what people were experiencing. What does this experience mean? There were important economists in France. Many of the most important early economists were French economic theorists. And there were economists in other parts of Europe as well. But the most influential theoretical defense of the new industrial capitalist economy developed among the classical economists in Britain. And their theories, as we'll see later, were often criticized. But what I want to look at in this lecture is the work of Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, and David Ricardo, three theorists who created an intellectual framework for all later debates about modern economic life. So, the starting point for these new forms of social thought was, of course, the industrial economic system itself. So let's talk a little about what the Industrial Revolution did, what it meant. In most general terms, the Industrial Revolution can be described as the transition from an economy based on hand tools and animal or human power to an economy based on machine tools and machine power. It's a change from one kind of power and technology to another. And the economic transformation was always linked to a technological revolution, new methods for production. And in fact, since the early days of the Industrial Revolution, this revolution in productive technology has been almost continuous since the 18th century. In fact, we've been going through the latest phase of the Industrial Revolution in the computer revolution of recent decades. Each era since the 18th century has brought new technologies into the economic world, and this in turn has transformed economic life. But in the first phases of the Industrial Revolution, there was a close connection to an agricultural revolution. In fact, there had to be an agricultural revolution even before there could be an industrial revolution. This agricultural revolution placed land ownership in a shrinking class of large landowners who could produce larger amounts of food with increasing efficiency. And this social change in the organization of agriculture was accompanied by new kinds of technology, new fertilizers, new kinds of machinery, all of which enabled fewer people to produce more food. And this, of course, is the basic pattern of modern agriculture in all modern societies. Now, in the 18th century, a group of economic theorists in France began to study these agricultural processes. This group of theorists is called the physiocrats because they were concerned with the process of the physical geography and economy of 18th century France. And in many ways, the modern economic theory in Europe was launched by the study of agriculture. The early physiocrats included writers such as Turgot and Quesnay, who argued that governments should allow free markets for grain production, for the production and distribution of grain. And they said that what was needed was a laissez-faire system, French word laisser, to leave or to let, and faire, to do, to let it do its own thing, to let it be. There will be an answer. Let it be laissez-faire. And that was, in a sense, what they were saying. Just let it be, and it will develop in its own way. Because traditionally, the government was very active in setting the prices for grain and wheat and bread. And the physiocrats said we need a more open system in which the prices will rise or fall according to the market. Now these theories, the theories of the physiocrats, began to attract attention in Britain, where the changes in the agrarian system were producing a large supply of cheap labor. Because as the farms became consolidated, many people left the farms looking for work. And this search for work coincided with the arrival of cheap raw materials from Britain's empire. Because it's precisely in this period that in the New World, of course, in America, but also increasingly in Asia, in India, and other places, raw materials, cotton and so forth, were being brought into Britain. The cheap labor and the cheap raw materials could therefore be put to productive use because of the development of new machines, especially in the new textile industry. So the new textile industry brought together steam-powered machines, lots of workers who needed work, and the need for coal and cotton. And in this situation, whole new towns emerged in Britain. Towns in northern parts of England, the most famous of which was Manchester, a city that grew from a small village of less than 30,000 people, maybe 25,000 people, in 1770, and by 1850 had grown to over 450,000 people. An enormous urban development. But there were other towns in the Midlands of England. These new towns were crowded, they were dirty, they were filled with uprooted people who had left their traditional homes. These people worked for very low wages, and most of the workers had about a 14-hour day. Very difficult working conditions, and everyone in the family worked, the children as well as the women and the men. And most of this labor was low-skilled work, repetitive processes of labor, but there were also frequent cycles of unemployment because there was simply the supply would outrun the demand and they would shut down parts of the factory. There was very little regulation of work, of working conditions. There was little regulation of markets or no regulation. So the system produced unprecedented wealth for the owners of the new industries, the new textile magnates. But it also produced a rapidly growing new class of workers. And people outside of England became interested in this new economy. And they became interested in the people in England who were trying to describe it or explain it. So that English economists became influential more generally in European intellectual life. They were somewhat like the German philosophers. By the early 19th century, people looked to Germany for the most advanced philosophy, and in the early 19th century, they looked to England for the most advanced economic theorists. Well, the English economists became famous for their laissez-faire theories. They adopted this idea that the physiocrats had developed. They used the very same term, the French term, laissez-faire, which both explained what was happening, in their view, but also justified what was happening. And so the classical British economists were somewhat like the French physiocrats. They shared the physiocrats' desire to find the natural laws of economic life. And the starting point for this method of economic analysis was the famous work of Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith is probably the most influential economist, certainly of the 18th century, and one of the most influential economists in all of modern European history. He lived from 1723 to 1790, and he published his most famous book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, a book that established his reputation as a major economist. Smith was a professor of moral economy at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. He didn't begin as an economist, and in various ways he was concerned with moral and philosophical questions, but he spent time in France. He actually traveled to France, and he became aware of a number of the economic theorists who were working at that time, and he met some of the physiocrats. He actually met people like Turgot and Quesnay, who had been developing their theories about laissez-faire economic life. And Smith was very impressed with their concept of laissez-faire economic policies. But he pushed the idea in a somewhat different direction, because the French had been convinced that land is the basis of all wealth, and it is the production of the agricultural sector which is most important. That may reflect the French situation, where agriculture was more important than industry. But Smith decided that although laissez-faire ideas were correct, that in the end, labor was more important than land in producing wealth. And Smith argued that wealth could accumulate most efficiently if business activity were free of government intervention. And what Smith argued, very much in the Enlightenment tradition, was that there are natural laws of economic life. Just as there are natural laws of politics, or laws of nature, there are natural laws of economic life. But these natural laws can only function efficiently in a free market. And this market, like nature, was controlled by a natural law of supply and demand. So what Smith thought he was doing was developing a theory that adhered to what actually happened in the laws of economic life. Again, the Enlightenment search for underlying laws or natural principles. Now, Smith assumed that in the economic life of modern societies, each nation had what he called a comparative advantage in some area of the market. For example, sugar producers who lived and worked in the West Indies had an advantage in producing sugar. There was no way that people living in England could produce sugar. So in the world market, sugar producers in the West Indies could produce and sell sugar at the most attractive market price. But they could not ever compete with, say, British pen makers, people who made things out of metal or who could produce textiles. And so as Smith described it, the modern economy would be divided into different regions or places in the world or within a nation itself in which people would produce at a comparative advantage the goods, products, and services that they could produce most efficiently. And this would create an efficient, natural economic system. Now, Smith believed that workers and owners of capital could benefit from what he called the invisible hand of the market. He said the market functions in a kind of mysterious way that it just adapts to the laws of supply and demand. But Smith also argued that people must enter the market, participate in the market, with some kind of moral restraint, and everyone should be allowed to benefit. Smith was not simply an unfeeling or uninterested theorist who said, well, let's just see how everyone can get the most. He really believed that the market could work to everybody's advantage, and he wanted that to be the way it worked. Well, Smith's theory spread very quickly among liberal, intellectual, and social circles in Europe. And by the early 19th century, Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, had been translated into every language in Western Europe, except Portuguese. The Portuguese were a little slow in getting to Smith's work. But by the early 19th century, Smith was setting the model for the modern study of economics, had enormous influence. And Smith had a very optimistic view of economic markets. He expected a steady social progress to emerge from a free market system. He was confident that the invisible hand of the market would benefit everyone. But by the early 19th century, it was becoming clear that most workers were not getting more wealth. This was the problem. They were living in almost subsistent conditions in crowded cities such as Manchester and other places where the living conditions did not seem to be improving. So now a new theoretical problem emerged. Why has the situation not changed very significantly? And this was the context that led to the work of a new group of theorists, and which led to the work of David Ricardo, who became the most influential economist in the early 19th century. Ricardo lived from 1772 to 1823. He was a wealthy English stockbroker. He made a lot of money in the stock market. He understood how to speculate in stocks. He was a real master at it. But he developed also an interest in the theoretical questions of how the economy worked. And so he began to write, and he wrote a long and important book called The Principles of Political Economy, a book that was published in 1817. And among other things, Ricardo was trying to explain why workers were poor. Why had they not moved to a significantly higher economic position? This was the problem. And in order to answer this question, Ricardo drew on the important population theories of a good friend of his, Thomas Malthus. He knew Malthus well. He was often in contact with him. And Malthus had recently published an important short book called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And Malthus's work is one of the most influential essays ever written about the problem of the relation between population and social life or economic life. Malthus lived from 1766 to 1834. And throughout the early 19th century, his work attracted a lot of attention. It still attracts a lot of attention, for that matter. There are still Malthusians in the world. We're still debating the problem of population. How does it affect economic and social development? Well, Malthus said that as workers gained wealth, they produced more children. This was the pattern. When people have more money, they produce more children, but then they don't have enough food. In fact, Malthus argued that the whole modern world, the whole development of the modern economy was threatened by the rapid growth of population. He said that we can only carry the economic and social development so far before we run into a crisis. And the Malthusian conception of population and its danger, the danger of too much population, has remained one of the most influential social theories to come out of the 19th century. It continues to influence the analysis of the world's social and economic problems. Malthus argued that the population of modern nations was growing what he called geometrically. It was growing rapidly. It was growing in a geometrical way, so that the number of people was likely to double every few decades. So population grows 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, etc. And we've actually seen some of this in recent decades, the way the population doubles in shorter and shorter periods of time, an amazing phenomenon. But Malthus claimed that the food supply was only growing arithmetically, that is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The food supply was growing, but there was an inevitable gap between the growth of the two. And so the population was bound to outgrow the food supply, and there was bound to be a problem of famine in the future, that there was a kind of inevitability of famine in the modern world. And Malthus became known as a prophet of gloom and doom, because his theory suggested that whenever workers moved above a subsistence level, they inevitably began to have too many babies. It's an interesting theory. It sort of looks at workers as people who, unlike others, cannot gain rational control over their own lives, that as soon as you give them more to eat, they produce more babies. Well, that was Malthus's view, and he assumed that this population pattern would lead to future food crises and to death. Well, Ricardo was very aware of the Malthusian population theory. And he drew on this theory to describe what he called the iron law of wages. And this was one of the main themes of his book, an essay on the principles of political economy. When he was writing about the economic life, he developed this iron law of wages. Now, according to Ricardo, this law showed that wages should not rise above a subsistence level because an increase beyond this level results in too many children and ultimately an imbalance in the food supply. He's taking Malthus's argument and applying it to the problem of wages. So wages, according to Ricardo, are naturally at a subsistence level. Workers naturally have to remain poor because if wages rise, then we have a demographic crisis. So this is the economic problem that cannot be avoided. There's no way out of it. And classical economics, as explained by Ricardo, assumed that the economic laws of the whole system necessarily make most people poor. So Ricardo, following this iron law of wages, Ricardo was a much more pessimistic analyst of the economic system than Adam Smith had been, because Adam Smith assumed that the market economy would naturally lift everyone. The rising tide would lift all the boats. But Ricardo saw poverty as a basic fact of competition in the marketplace. And he saw this system as inevitably leading to a reality of a gap between the rich and the poor. There was no way to escape this problem. It was the law. Again, it's a law of nature. It's a law of economic life. Now, Ricardo's book quickly became a classic and popular work. It was popular among economic theorists who thought it gave a scientific explanation for why the wages were low, but it also became very popular among industrialists who believed that this book explained why the workers' wages should stay low. You can see why the industrialists found Ricardo's argument quite persuasive, because it justified low wages. We can't raise the wages because if we do, we're going to have overpopulation. So we keep the wages low. It's in everybody's best interest. Now, I think this theory, the iron law of wages, helps to explain why political economy gained a reputation as the dismal science, because it's a rather dismal view of the human condition. It suggests that people must remain poor, and it says that these conditions of the new industrial economy, the poverty, the misery, reflect certain natural and inescapable social laws. We may not like it, but hey, that's the way it is. We can't fight the laws of nature. That was Ricardo's view, and that's why it was called, in many ways, the dismal science. But some writers soon began to question the assumptions or the laws of Ricardo and the other economic theorists who were accepting Ricardo's arguments. And these critics began to develop a critique of the new industrial system and a critique of classical economics. They saw the two as linked, both the system and the theorist. Now, some of these critiques of the new economy and of the economic theory emerged among romantic writers of the era. And others began to emerge in the new theories of early socialism. And in fact, various forms of romanticism and socialism began to fuse into a new social critique of industrial capitalism. And when the romanticism and socialism began to come together, a new debate emerged about capitalism, about the meaning and consequences of capitalism. And this debate about capitalism, which emerged in the early 19th century, has continued down to our own time. But in order to understand the debate, we now need to turn to the critics of the classical economists and of the Industrial Revolution, And that's what we'll do in the next lecture.